It's time for Kings Prospect Check-In, and we talk NHL head coaching controversy on this edition of Locked On LA Kings.
You are Locked On Kings, your daily podcast on the Los Angeles Kings, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey, Kings fans, welcome to Locked On LA Kings, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thanks for making Locked On LA Kings your first listen every day. We are free and available wherever you get your podcasts. We would love for you to leave us a positive comment on Apple Podcasts if you're a fan of the show. And we are on YouTube. Please like and subscribe if you're enjoying this content. I'm Eddie Garcia, your host of Locked On LA Kings. I've worked in sports media for the past 30 years, 20 plus years at the Fox Sports Radio Network. Also co-host of the Puck Podcast, a weekly NHL review show that's been putting out content for the past 17 years, and a passionate LA Kings fan for over 30 years. I need to tell you about Monopoly Go. It is the fast-paced game that lets you team up with friends for tournaments to unlock awesome prizes like unique stickers for trading, cool playing pieces, and hilarious emojis for taunting your friends. Download Monopoly Go, now free on Google Play or the App Store. Game on. Coming up in today's show, I wanted to discuss the LA Kings coaching staff and their relationship to a controversial coach that was recently in the news again. The Ontario Reign signed a player. We'll give you details on that coming up. I wanted to start with a look back at the season for some of the Kings' recent draft picks. This also ties into one of the big events coming up for the Kings and the NHL. That, of course, is the NHL entry draft at the end of this month. That's Friday, June 28th and Saturday, June 29th in Las Vegas. As it stands right now, the Kings have the 21st overall selection. And yes, we will be getting more into the NHL draft in the coming days, including hopefully an interview with some insight on who the players the Kings could be interested in. But for today, we're going to look back at recent LA Kings draft picks. We also have a bit of news regarding a recent Kings pick. That would be 19-year-old forward Matthew Mania, one of those names that's hard to forget. Well, he was a part of a 6-player trade today that included 9 draft picks. The Sudbury Wolves sent Mania and 3 other players to the Flint Firebirds for 2 players and 9 draft picks. Now, what does this mean for the LA Kings? Well, nothing really. It just means that one of their prospects will be playing in a different place for a different coach. But the Kings, or any other NHL team, have absolutely no say in how those drafted players will be trained or utilized. The players' rights belong to the LA Kings, but that's it. So to use a wild example, let's say the Los Angeles Chargers drafted a football player out of high school, and then he went to go play at USC. The Chargers have no say over how the Trojans give him playing time or what position he plays or anything. They just have his rights. So if he plays well at USC, they could sign him to a pro contract after his playing time is up there. So maybe a little bit of an unusual example, but trying to just tell you how it works in hockey. As for Matthew Mania, the defenseman was a 5th-round pick of the Kings last season. He had shoulder surgery to start this season, and that certainly didn't help things for him. Ended up playing 45 games, had 4 goals and 23 points. Hopefully he'll be fully healthy and ready to go for a big season next year. And there is some optimism around what type of player Matthew Mania could eventually turn into for the LA Kings. Now, the Memorial Cup is something you may or may not know about. The championship game took place last night. The Memorial Cup is the big junior championship. Mostly in Canada. Mostly it consists of Canadian teams, but there are some U.S. teams as well. As a matter of fact, a U.S. team won it all. But the Memorial Cup this year did include an LA King recent draft pick, and that would be the recently signed Caleb Lawrence. Lawrence was a 7th-round pick of the Kings in 2022, and he was playing for the London Knights. Unfortunately for Caleb and his teammates, they lost a heartbreaker 4-3 in the title game to the Saginaw Spirit, who scored the game-winning goal with 21 seconds left in regulation. That was the final Ontario Hockey League game for Lawrence, who will join the Ontario Reign next season. This season in the OHL, playing for both the Ottawa 67s and the London Knights, the 6'6" Lawrence had 20 goals and 37 points in 58 games. He also performed very well this postseason with 5 goals and 9 points in 8 games. Obviously, his size stands out, and as you might expect, it does come with a bit of a physical edge to it for him. He was given a 5-minute suspension, or should we say a 5-game suspension last month for a big hit in a game against the Kitchener Rangers. Now, the Kings signed Lawrence to a 3-year entry-level deal last week. You might wonder, how does a 6'6" forward who clearly has some skill fall to the Kings in the final round of the draft? Well, the Kings in recent drafts, because of where they're drafting and because of not only where as far as the pick selection, but also what rounds they're picking in, because the Kings have obviously sacrificed some of their draft picks in order to obtain players in trades. So the Kings have been having a philosophy, which I agree with, to swing big, take some risks with the chance that if you hit on it, it could be a special player. Now, there's still obviously a lot for Caleb Lawrence to prove, but for example, he was a guy who had great size, and when he was playing had ability, but he had health issues. And so there were teams that obviously backed away from him. And the Kings said, you know what? If he stays healthy, we think he can turn into a player. And sure enough, the Kings draft him 7th round. He now has been healthy and productive since then. So the Kings take a chance. It's paid off. And if they were to redraft the draft and Caleb Lawrence had been doing what he's been doing lately, he obviously would not have lasted to the 7th round. So good on Mark Yannetti, the Kings director of amateur scouting, and his staff for taking a risk and possibly finding a player that could be something in the coming years. Now, again, the Kings are looking to kind of continue that philosophy, I think, coming up. Again, they do have a 1st-round pick, 21st. But again, with the lack of number of picks that they have and where they're drafting, I think this philosophy will be continuing going forward, with the thinking of, and I agree with the philosophy that if you play it safe, right, and you go after a player, you're like, yeah, we don't think he's going to be great, but he's got a chance to be a good AHL, potentially NHL player. What's the point of that? You can find those guys in free agency or in trades. Go big, and yeah, there's a chance it might not work out, but if it does, then you've got a player. Now, if you're talking about picking in the top 10 or something like that, then it makes more sense to go with a player that you think is going to definitely be an NHL caliber player. But when you're picking at the lower end of the draft, or if you're picking, 4th, 5th, 6th round, I say go for it, man. Go for some guys who maybe they're undersized, but they got a lot of skill, or maybe there's been some issues with them that makes them a risk. But in the end, if they can figure it out, and these are young players you're dealing with, then there's the potential. And I think Caleb Lawrence has been a pretty good example of that for the LA Kings. We talked a little bit about the goaltender Hampton Slakinski in a recent episode. For those that maybe missed it, 4th-round pick of the Kings last year, was named the USHL Goalie of the Year and backstopped the Fargo Force to the USHL title. Very exciting young prospect for the Kings at the goalie position, and he's going to play at Northern Michigan University next season. Speaking of college hockey, the Kings' 6th-round pick last season, right winger Ryan Comrie, led the University of New Hampshire in goals and points as a freshman this past season. He had 14 goals and 31 points in 34 games, so a very promising first collegiate season for Ryan Comrie. Also, forward Jared Wright won the national championship as a member of the University of Denver team this past season. He was a 6th-round pick of the Kings in 2022. He played in all 44 games for Denver this season, his sophomore year. He had 15 goals, which was tied for 4th on the team, and 25 points. Solid contributor and should only get better, playing with a lot of talented players as he goes on in his college career over the next 2 more years of eligibility. He was also named the most sportsmanlike player on the team for the 2nd year in a row. The Kings signed defenseman Angus Booth to an entry-level contract last month. He had finished his time playing in the Quebec Maritime Junior Hockey League for 2 different teams this past season. He finished with 3 goals, 28 points in 61 games. He was a plus 29 this season. He was a 4th-round pick in 2022, so we'll look forward to seeing how he does with the Ontario Reign next season. So those were 5 players drafted over the past 2 years for the LA Kings that they have hopes can turn into eventual contributors in the Kings organization, and thought it was worth checking on them now that their seasons have come to an end. Up next, the Kings coaching staff, past and present, has been connected to a controversial coaching figure. We'll talk about that next here on Locked On LA Kings, your team every day. Hey, I have to admit, I have a competitive side. I think we all do. And my competitive side enjoys playing Monopoly Go. I'm sure you've heard of it. It's been downloaded 150 million times. It's a great twist on Monopoly where you can play not one, but hundreds of Monopoly boards in crazy locations, building up amazing cities that bring you big money. But the best part is messing with your friends. I can charge them rent on my iconic properties, just like classic Monopoly. But now I can also rob their vaults of riches for myself. And the leaderboards show me who is the biggest Monopoly tycoon is. So team up with your friends and people all around the world in time tournaments and earn huge rewards. Get in on the game and download Monopoly Go, now free on the App Store or Google Play. So obviously we're in the off season and we're waiting for news to happen. Some days we've got news, some days we don't. I mentioned we have the draft coming up for the Kings. The Kings will be looking to sign players as we go along. They've got a lot of restricted and unrestricted free agents to make decisions on. But while we wait for news to happen, I do look around the league to see what stories are out there and if they have any possible connections to the LA Kings. There was a story recently in The Athletic about a former NHL head coach, Mike Babcock. And he has been a controversial figure as more and more details come out about how this successful former NHL coach treated people, in particular his players, over his NHL coaching career that started with the Mighty Ducks of Anaheim back in the 2002-2003 season. In all of his stops, Anaheim, Detroit, Toronto, and most recently Columbus, there was a pretty clear pattern of a coach that seemed to take a lot of joy in the power that he could wield over people, and in particular, some of his players. Now, to be sure, there are plenty of coaches out there in all sports that will play mind games with players. They will look to keep players kind of on the edge in an effort to maybe get the most out of them. There is no set way to handle players who obviously have come from different backgrounds. They have different personalities. And a successful head coach finds ways to motivate players. And there's typically no one way to do that. But there is a difference between motivating players and challenging players and just effing with them. There are infamous stories involving Mike Babcock with players like Hall of Famer Mike Modano, who was one game away from playing in his 1,500th NHL game. He was playing for Mike Modano in Detroit for Mike Babcock in Detroit, and Babcock benched him, prevented him from getting that milestone, and Modano finished his career with 1,499 games played. Now you think that's not a big deal. Well, in Toronto, there was a incident with Mitch Marner, the Maple Leafs star, when he was a rookie, where Babcock asked him to write down players on the team that he didn't feel were giving the best effort. And as a young rookie player, your coach tells you to do something, you do it. Babcock then took that list and read it aloud in the locker room to all the players, with Marner sitting there mortified, and they brought him to tears. Also in Detroit, Babcock had a player named Johan Franzen, who was a consistent target of his. It got so bad, he apparently had a nervous breakdown. And there are other stories, but Babcock was also a very successful coach, won a Stanley Cup in Detroit, guided two other teams to the final. And because of that, a lot of people in those organizations, in Anaheim, in Detroit, in Toronto, looked the other way when he treated players and members of the organization in a less than respectful way. Now, there are always going to be players who don't like coaches. There is always going to be players who feel like that coach didn't like me and he gave me a raw deal and he didn't treat me the best way. And there's always going to be players who maybe have an axe to grind against a coach. I have no doubt that there are some players who were not targeted by Babcock who would also say that he made them better players and they had a lot of success playing for him. But with Babcock, it's story after story after story in every place that he coached about him being more than just a challenging coach. The latest incident saw Babcock get fired by the Columbus Blue Jackets before he ever coached a single game for the team this season. He apparently made some of his players on the Blue Jackets hand over their iPhones to him so he could look through them. And the players complained. And because of his history, the Blue Jackets had him on a short leash and they decided he's not worth it and they fired him. So what does this have to do with the LA Kings? Well, the Kings' last two head coaches, Todd McClellan and now Jim Hiller, are from the Mike Babcock coaching tree. McClellan was Babcock's number one assistant in Detroit when they won the Stanley Cup. Jim Hiller and current Kings assistant DJ Smith were both Mike Babcock's assistants when he was with the Toronto Maple Leafs. Now, I'm not suggesting in any way that McClellan or Hiller or Smith treat players like Mike Babcock did. As a matter of fact, I've never heard anything negative about how those men treat their players in a bad way. Now, I'm sure all these men did learn a lot under Mike Babcock, not just about strategy and organization that a head coach needs to have to be successful, something Babcock has been credited with, but also maybe how not to treat people. I would hope, and it does seem, that McClellan and Hiller and Smith took the good and left the bad from their experience with Mike Babcock. Now, Jim Hiller has talked about making Kings players uncomfortable this season. And clearly that's about challenging players to be accountable and to make them better and to get the Kings where they need to be, where they want to be. But there's obviously a right way and a wrong way to go about doing that. Now, players today are certainly different than they were 20 years ago, and coaches need to evolve and be successful too. I have no doubt that Mike Babcock was an influence on Jim Hiller and Todd McClellan and DJ Smith. So hopefully that also meant Jim Hiller seeing how to do things and how not to do things. And hopefully we will see him do the right things with how he treats the players and how he challenges them the right way. And the Kings can have success under Jim Hiller. So hopefully you found that interesting. Up next, the Kings, more specifically Ontario Reign, did sign a player today. We'll give you the details on that here next on Locked On LA Kings, your team every day. It is playoff time in the NBA and NHL as we are at the finals in both of those sports. Baseball's in full swing, and FanDuel is your place to bet on every game. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets guaranteed. That's $150 win or lose. Bet on everything from slap shots to home runs to slam dunks, all on an app that is safe, secure, and easy to use. Unfortunately, we can't bet on the Kings, or the Lakers, or the Clippers anymore, but we can still bet against the teams that beat our teams. The Oilers and the Mavericks are both in the finals, and, well, we can bet against them, hopefully. Yes, we definitely are hoping the Florida Panthers win. At least I am. How about Dodger fans? You can place bets on if the Dodgers are going to win it all this year. Certainly looking good in first place. And it is a great time of the year to be a sports fan, and it can be even better by winning with FanDuel. You can bet on who's going to win, who's going to lose, or things like how many home runs Shohei Ohtani will hit this year. You can do it all on an app that is safe, secure, and easy to use at FanDuel. What are you waiting for? Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make your first bet an automatic win. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. We do have a little bit of Kings-related news to pass along. The Ontario Reign re-signed for Jacob Doty for next season. The 30-year-old returns to Ontario for a 6th consecutive season. Also his 10th season of professional hockey. He is a native of Billings, Montana, and he is the longest tenured member of the Ontario Reign. He set AHL career highs with 7 goals, 10 points in 57 games last season. That also included 80 penalty minutes. Now, you might remember Doty went with the LA Kings on their preseason trip to Australia to add a little muscle to the lineup, and he did to the delight of the hockey fans in Australia who maybe don't get to see a lot of NHL caliber hockey in person. Jacob Doty did get into a fight in one of those preseason games against the Arizona Coyotes down under. Doughty is the first player signed by the Ontario Reign for the upcoming season. Now, there is a difference between the Kings signing a player and the Reign signing a player. For example, Etude Yemsen was a player that the Kings signed recently, and he's going to be assigned to play for the Ontario Reign next season. For Jacob Doty, he was actually signed by the Reign to play for the Reign next season. And I know that some have suggested, I've seen occasionally, about the Kings calling up a player like Jacob Doty so they can have some toughness in their lineup. Now, it's possible that they could do that. It's an option that's available to them. And maybe if there was a specific game where the Kings needed a specific tough guy for some reason, then Jacob Doty would certainly fit the bill. But Jacob Doty is an AHL player. He's down there to protect the prospects, provide some toughness. He's never played in an NHL game as far as a regular season game. We've talked about the preseason. Again, 10 seasons of professional hockey, has yet to play an NHL game. Be awesome if he could get into a game at some point, but it's likely that's not going to happen. Like I said, there are specific players, captain of the Ontario Reign, TJ Tynan, another guy who the Kings need to re-sign if they want to keep him around. They're specifically playing to be AHL players, and they do a very good job. They have a specific role. It's almost like they're a player coach kind of a situation. Veteran guys who want to continue to get paid to play professional hockey, not ready to hang up the skates yet, and basically stay in the AHL to provide leadership and whatnot, teach the younger players how to be pros, that kind of thing. And maybe once their playing career is over, the organizations will keep them around as a scout, or if they're interested in being a coach, certainly things like that are a possibility as well. Whether that's something for Jacob Doty in the future or not, who knows? But again, just a veteran AHL guy that the Ontario Reign are bringing back for next season. And I'm sure if you're a fan of the Ontario Reign, a player like Jacob Doty is going to be a fan favorite. Like I said, a guy who is willing to drop the gloves, stick up for his teammates, and be one of those kind of guys that every hockey team kind of needs to have. It is a role that is being kind of phased out of pro hockey, but it's not there yet. Fighting is still allowed in the NHL. It's still allowed in all forms of professional hockey. And Jacob Doty is one of those guys who can kind of fill that role. So he'll be back with the Ontario Reign for one more season. That is going to do it for today's show for you everydayers, those of you that listen and watch Locked On LA Kings every day. Coming up on Wednesday's show, Carl Balikian from the Bannerman podcast is scheduled to join us. We have never had him on the show before, and just another example of trying to get some other voices out there that follow and are passionate about the LA Kings to talk about the Kings. Thursday, we're going to continue our Kings player profiles, take a look at Kings forward Trevor Moore, a guy who played for Mike Babcock back in the day in Toronto. Would love to talk to Trevor Moore about some of his experiences with him, if he would be willing to talk about it. And always coming up on Friday, we will have another Kings fan feedback show, your chance to talk about anything going on with the LA Kings that is on your mind. Certainly the draft coming up, like I said, talking about some of the young prospects for the LA Kings. If you're excited about any of those guys, you want to talk about it, certainly can do that. The email address is lockedoneddie@gmail.com, EDDIE. And you can always leave your comments if you're watching on YouTube in the comments section. We appreciate that. Not only do you get your voice heard, but it also helps the algorithm for people to find the show. If you're scrolling through YouTube, the likes, the subscribes make the show become more visible to other people. So we appreciate that. And we would love you to stay interactive with the show on social media, X, Twitter, Instagram. We are at Locked On LA Kings. I'm Eddie Garcia. Thank you as always for listening and watching this episode of Locked On LA Kings, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Have a great rest of your day. We'll talk to you on Wednesday. And as always, go Kings, go.